So, in today's episode, we're going to be talking about sort of a broad range of topics, but how it kind of started was the news coming out about Taylor Swift's carbon emissions, her use of private jets so often, and these kind of conversations. But the broader topic is environmental justice, finance, offsets, debt relief, and all of this kind of environmental justice angles in light of celebrities and the other 1% most highest earners in the country in the world producing more emissions than the bottom 50% of earners. And the bottom 50% of earners are also typically much more vulnerable to climate change, of course, due to a variety of reasons. And to help us with this conversation with this topic, we're joined by Injy Johnston and Injy Johnstone. Sorry, Johnstone. Injy Johnstone is a research associate and net zero aligned offsetting at the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group and researcher at Oxford Net Zero. Although a lawyer by training, I'm an interdisciplinary researcher whose work focuses on how to steer the current carbon market and broader climate policy landscape towards net zero alignment. My PhD looked at net zero as a source of legal obligation under international law, including the environmental integrity of carbon markets. Feel free to make that less formal, though. Oh gosh. Oh wait, I probably should have changed that before reading that out. But anyway, thank you for joining us, Inji. Yeah, welcome.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, great to be here.
What a
Yeah, and I
joke.
thought, sorry.
I said, what a joke.
I know. I thought of it before. Yeah, slightly before recording. I'm like, I'm a genius. Let's go for it. Um, but yeah. Basically, so. I thought maybe we could start off with Angie just kind of giving an introduction to one of the pieces that kind of inspired the topic of this podcast. She co-wrote, I believe, with another author, a piece called that hasn't been published yet, called "Are Taylor Swift's carbon credits offsets credible, or are the fakers gonna fake, 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 fake?" So, would you like to maybe talk a little bit about this article and yeah, how
An
it kind of
important
came to be.
question. Do you have to say fake, 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 fake in like the melody? Or is it
Yeah, it's
okay?
it's 100% essential, I think. But it would have been really funny to read it out just in very monotone. But yeah, yeah, should say it's absolutely essential. Well, yeah, thank you. Well, so I guess the piece really again was born out of this time with Taylor Swift has been Time Woman of the Year. She's been all over the press and has been doing these amazing big concerts. I think even to the extent of like causing earthquakes in parts of the US, at least I've seen from like how packed the stadiums are. Um, and yeah, it's really interesting. So that at the height of celebrity, that she's reached now, there's this much kind of darker and more insidious story, I guess, about the carbon emissions this is all generating. And more broadly, I think it kind of just highlights that, you know, no longer do we kind of just are happy putting any kind of celebrity or actor kind of on a pedestal. We're really looking at critically like all aspects of their engaging with society. And so yeah, with Taylor, that kind of emerged with this tour of hers that she'd been taking a number of private jets, and that although the data can be a bit patchy about, whether she's on a flight on a private jet at a given time. And, some of the recorded flights were as short as, 17 minutes, which is, obviously pretty crazy. And I think it's not only crazy just for, I guess, the reason, why she's doing it. It's just kind of, like there is alternatives and she can definitely afford those alternatives. But, more broadly, I think it speaks to this kind of culture of consumerism and kind of just, wanting to have the good stuff and kind of ignoring the bad. And, one major way that comes across in the market today is through, the implicit allowance or acceptability of carbon offsetting. And carbon offsetting, obviously it is possible for it to be done right. And I think it's important to kind of say that up front that, I don't fundamentally, and in theory, it can work. And if you're doing it right, and some actors, very, very limited range are, um, yeah, it can essentially balance out. But the vast majority, 99.99%, are doing it wrong. And this has huge consequences, not only for climate, but also for equity and justice. And so I think it's really interesting that when this piece, this issue came to light, it really brought to the fore that no one's unimpeachable for all these kind of developments, and that actually we have to be wholly accountable as a public person and as public organizations are. And you know, we've seen this trend as well with some bigger organizations and you know, being having their carbon offsets questioned and brought to light. And it's really interesting because as soon as you start shining transparency in these kind of areas, there's strong pushback. And I think we saw that also with the tracking of private jets, not only Taylor's, but Elon Musk's and others. And I think it brings to light a lot of fundamental questions about why there is such a lack of transparency, and again, why people are so afraid to kind of unmask the full extent of their carbon impact on the environment. So I think I'll end there, but yeah, looking forward to continuing the conversation.
I don't want to belabor the point on Taylor Swift because I think she's gotten a lot of pushback and a lot of spotlighting of her carbon emissions, which is a little, I don't want to say shady, but like from the things that I've seen, she was at the top of the list for carbon emissions for like 2022, and then she's nowhere on the list for 2023. And you know, that's when we start seeing some of the narrative from publicists and other people of like, oh, she bought, you know, like double
Peer pressure
the
works.
offsets. Yeah, and you know, she a couple of months ago, as we're recording this in March of 2024, had the whole debacle that got a lot of airtime with the student that publishes like private jet trackers on Twitter and everything else to show how much people are using their private jets and emitting, you know, all the other stuff. And her legal team sent a cease and desist letter. So that got a lot of media attention for the fact that her team was kind of claiming that it was a compromise of her compromising her security to be publishing that data, even though it's publicly available. So that started a lot more cultural conversation around her footprint personally, but like she isn't on any of the lists for 2023 as like the top emitters. She isn't, or I mean, she was kind of bullied. I wouldn't say bullied, but she was
Cyberbullying.
pressured to, you know, sell her second jet, you know, for those optics and stuff. So I think it is interesting to look at how this kind of public narrative, the pressure that fan bases and other, I want to call them activists, but other people bringing attention to these issues can do to kind of shape the ways in which people are engaging around this issue and contributing to it or fighting against it. So keep up the Lord's work. But also thinking
Keep up
of
your tweeting on X and yeah, keep it up.
yeah, sadly that still like what am I trying to say? That still contributes to Elon Musk's pocket and relevance, I guess. I don't know. I don't want to talk about Twitter or X.
We've done enough,
Yeah.
basically, and you can correct me in time. But carbon credit offsets are when companies, countries, or other entities, individuals can do it as well. Basically, purchase credits sold through. There's different ways that the credits are sort of justified or would you say created. It's basically about emissions avoided, about the way that emissions are like you can purchase credits for the for companies or countries or entities refusing to like choosing to not cut down a forest, for example, and then the carbon credits, the carbon saved by not cutting down the forest is then assigned a quantitative value, which is then converted to like monetary value. So when I take a flight, it costs, you know, however much carbon, and then I can buy carbon offsets to of the equal value of the carbon emitted through my flight. And as you say, it's kind of hard to verify a lot of these carbon offsets. Their sort of reliability and how well they're actually being tracked. And yeah, so I guess could you maybe talk a little bit about that? Just sort of like the sort of questionable nature of carbon offsets.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to start with, so there's three main types of carbon credits, I'd say, and then it's not always a given that a credit would be used as an offset. So it's perfectly
Yeah.
legitimate for someone, wanting to go and support climate action, to go and buy some carbon credits and say, I've, had that
Just for
impact.
fun.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But yeah, where it becomes problematic is when it's compensating for an ongoing or like future emission elsewhere, and that is exactly what happened on the tour. But to come back to it, so there's three main types of carbon credits or carbon projects. So you've got the avoided emissions ones that you talked about. So yeah, it's paying someone not to not to emit, and often that is to avoid deforestation. And these are the class of credits that make up the bulk of the carbon market today. And often that's really surprising to people because the first thing we think about when we think of carbon credits is that, oh, someone's gone to plant a tree. But that's only like a fraction, like less than 5% of credits are actually planting trees. Most are paying people not to emit. And that gets really problematic because if you say to a group that you'll get paid for if they were going to chop down this forest, or if this forest was under threat from a government, then there's not many actors in the world that will turn down money for not doing something that they weren't going to do anyway.
Yeah.
And how I think about those type of credits is that I've been vegetarian all my life, and it's the equivalent sometimes of someone coming to me and saying, "I'll pay you to keep not eating meat." Whereas I was going to do that anyway, but if someone offers you money, people aren't going to turn it down, and that's exactly
Would
what's
you
happening.
say yes?
No, so I'd like to think no, but out of this
Depends on how rich they are. If it's
analogy.
Elon Musk, then just drain them. I don't
Yeah,
care.
well, exactly. Yeah, if it's to be fair, yeah, true. Didn't think about that scenario, but it's yeah, it is kind of crazy because we have seen a number of the like scandals. Sometimes the baseline or projected deforestation could be like 27 times more than was actually going to occur. Other times it might be paying people to protect like an already protected forest, that's protected by law, and or some kind of Gulf Reserve or nature reserve that people, again, it was never under threat of deforestation. But if someone's offered money to say they're definitely not going to cut down that tree, then under some standards that's been allowed to be a verified carbon credit, and then people have used that to offset their emissions. So that's about it depends on the type of system, but that can be about like 80% of the credits sometimes are avoided emissions projects. But then the credits rather, but then the biggest type of projects, so like the number of projects that, the category with the most projects is emissions reductions projects. And that's a whole wide range of things. So in some places, that is changing out the cook stoves people might be using to make a more fuel efficient one that requires no coal to burn, but it uses a cleaner burning fuel. It could be
That's
retrofitting.
like the solar cooking movement thing too, right? Is that correct?
It is,
Is
but yeah,
related to that?
I think they still use some natural like gas ones as well still, and so that also gets really problematic because also turning to renewable energy and kind of energy system credits more generally. Again, we've seen like gas and other kind of pollutants still kind of sneak through and get carbon credit funding at times. And so yeah, so that makes up the bulk of like not by project number, but still not as many credits issued as the avoided emissions. And again, like fundamentally, it's because I guess even when you're installing any kind of infrastructure, you're a bit more bounded by the rules of science and everything. So those are still like a better category. But then you also have carbon removal, and then carbon removal also comes in different shades. So on the one hand, you have the more impermanent conventional carbon removal, which could be like planting forests or restoring wetlands. And so that's what people, again, most people think of that when they think of the carbon market, planting trees, etc. And then you have these newer type of emerging carbon removal forms such as direct air capture and biochar, and that stores carbon on longer time scales. I mean, nearly everything's not permanent in the true geological scale, but some of that stuff is close to permanent as you can get. But again, here we have a huge cost range right across all the different types of carbon credits. So some selling for cents on the dollar, while others selling for, $600 to $800 a ton. And so again, so despite there being some options out there for actors, whether it's Taylor Swift or your next door neighbor looking to buy these carbon credits, in reality, much of the market is focused on these cheaper forms of credit, the dodgier forms of credit, and critically also sometimes credits that have been generated as far back as like 2006, 2007. So yeah, I looked at data just this week, and yeah, some companies like in 2023 were retiring credits from 2006, 2005. And yeah, if you talk to people on the street about that, people are going to say, well, that's kind of crazy. Like, we've already know what happened with the emissions back then, and we're still on this trajectory where emissions are rising. And yeah, it comes back to what we physically need. And so when I said that carbon offsetting can be done right, that requires actually balancing out residual emissions, so emissions that are still ongoing, with permanent or close to permanent removal. So that's the kind of way you can get atmospheric net zero from a strategy. But as I said, 99.99% of strategies are not that. And so it remains critical that we still do everything we can to reduce emissions first. And that means kind of taking a hard look at some of these choices, especially around private jets and other aspects of it, extreme wealth and extreme kind of carbon colonialism in some instances, and really start questioning those.
Yeah, I think that comes through very clearly in your article, and I think it does. Then that kind of opens up a lot of broader questions about sort of the utility of, yeah, just how far the utility of carbon markets and carbon offsetting really extends. It seems like companies and a lot of companies and things and individuals, wealthy individuals, are really behind carbon offsetting, like the idea a lot, because to a certain extent it does allow for things to just kind of do business as usual, continue as usual. Whereas, like, I know a lot of people in the global south are kind of critical of this, and we saw this at like the negotiations at COP, and that sort of the negotiations around the possibility of having the UN carbon market, like, and the rules around that. um, and I think this is, especially really, the sort of justice angle is really clear, comes through in another article that I sort of had us read for this podcast episode, from the UN Special Rapporteur. I never know how to pronounce that, on human rights and the environment. His name's David R. Boyd, and the title of this was Mobilizing Trillions for the Global South: The Imperative of Human Rights-Based Climate Finance. And interestingly, he actually wrote this right before COP28, the big UN environmental conference of 2023. And in it, he kind of lays out the disparity between the funding and the sort of support that global South countries and other climate vulnerable countries need because of the ongoing climate damage from climate change related events, like extreme weather events, things like this, and how this is, totals at least. He recommends that there needs to be at least 5 trillion annually for human rights based climate and sustainability action, whereas the goal set in 2009 at the Copenhagen conference was for $100 billion annually from developed countries and wealthy countries to these developing countries, and even that is not met. So it shows that, like carbon markets and carbon offsetting, like it's funding projects of um, keeping these forests from being destroyed and things like that to a certain extent. But the amount of like actual impact in light of the sort of vast amount of damage and funding that's needed for adaptation, loss and damage, all of these things, there's still very, very huge gap there that needs to be filled by other mechanisms. And I have the feeling that carbon markets at times, in a lot of people's eyes, and carbon offsets, and especially celebrities, as you say, kind of distracts from other forms of mitigation, other forms of funding, other forms of reducing our emissions, and having a reflective look on ourselves of, like, what are we doing? Yeah, I don't have that's just kind of my statement to throw out there for anybody to respond to.
Yeah, well, even just quickly, like, I think to take up your last point about the coming back to the individual point, I think it's always really useful to remind ourselves, like, the very notion of an individual carbon footprint and maybe the individual, net zero by extension now was a tool from the marketing department of BP. And so, that whole idea is to put it back on the individual and put it back on those choices. And yeah, like you said, carbon offsets could present the allure of choice, and saying that you had the chance when you took that flight or you took that bus, or when you did that, to offset it, and if you didn't, then yeah, it's your fault that we're in the system. But then yeah, I think it really comes back to looking at those broader systemic drivers, And what I think is really interesting and kind of often not recognized about the why national governments are supporting carbon markets, even the voluntary carbon market, so much and making it so easy for actors to engage in it, is because in a lot of ways it's privatizing what should have already been public climate finance going to these
Yeah,
countries.
exactly.
Yeah, and we're seeing like a lot of classic overseas development projects being shoehorned in as kind of carbon credit projects. And sometimes even when, carbon credit projects carbon credit funding might only be providing like, a small portion of the revenue, it still claims all the carbon benefits. And so again, it leads to huge kind of double counting and overestimation of of the kind of net impact of a dollar spent. And it's really interesting because in some, like when advocating for these markets to be reformed, that's some of the most stringent pushback that we face as researchers, because people say, do you not want, people getting cleaner cook stoves in the developing, and it's we're trying to say that's a false dichotomy. It's saying those projects, should be happening anyway, and there needs to be this accountability, but to the appropriate people, to the public governments, to provide that, and to yeah, like you said, to really scale up climate finance in the way that it's been promised. But yeah, the privatization has its issues, and carbon markets is one of those areas that I think those issues have become most pervasive and most apparent in recent years.
Probably never heard that before on this podcast. Privatization is an issue. No, I'm kidding. We say that all the
I was
time.
about to say, oh wow, imagine, yeah,
No,
actually,
we
you guys are like super right wing and being like, this is
no.
We love liberalism or neoliberalism. We love all the capitalism. It's our God. Not
yeah.
really.
This is the point of the podcast when you say, yeah, because obviously, like climate change is a scam. It's not real, and then I'm like, oh wow.
Thank you for proving our point. And that Taylor Swift is in a psyop with Travis Kelce, and they're going to take over the world and ruin it with communism.
Yeah.
Sorry, we're from well, we both went to Kansas State University, and Clayton's from North Carolina, so we have that sort of, right-wing streak in us. No, I'm kidding.
Right wing streak around us, sadly. Thinking about this, as like y'all mentioned before, the appeal of this whole economy of offsets and that other thing is just like, I mean, this is kind of aligning perfectly with the logic of capitalism and like economic rationality of, I'm going to continue what I'm doing, but we can actually sell this to potentially offset the impact of what we're doing, and we can buy, and it's just like moving money and numbers around, and in my view, doing very little but sustaining the system that we currently have, which is very capitalist exploitative, and specifically imperialist when looking at like the global stage, and how often the um, countries and governments of the global north and the more imperialist countries in the world are specifically exploiting and extracting from countries and areas in the global south. And like this just follows the exploitation that's been happening with colonialism, settler colonialism, and etc. And it's just very rich to look at this in the context that, um, the global south, a lot of those countries and places have been shaped so profoundly by the imperialism of other countries, and like their economic system, their government, their infrastructure around conservation and sustainability is kind of shaped around how the US or the UK wants resources that these locations have. And so like their very existence almost is tied up in that. And then as we're leeching off of these places, we, as in the global north, we're kind of being like, oh, but, even though we're taking all these resources, you can try to dig yourself out of debt and make your country better by selling these resources to us in another way. And we're just going to keep continuing doing what we're doing and making the world a better place and putting the burden on you. And I think that's an important dimension to kind of call out and add texture to this conversation of how profoundly this, economy and these relationships are shaping like so many places across the globe, and what we can and can't do when we're talking about conservation and fighting against pollution and climate change and all those other things. So that was a little rant, but I will end here.
There's one really great example of this actually changing, and in recent years will kind of recognize that like they have been exploited for many years in the carbon markets, and that so often it would be a project developer flying into a country, and like doing a few deals, figuring out the right people to bribe, and then making a ton of money off the back of it. No transparency, and this is in fact the world's biggest RED Plus avoided deforestation project, Kariba, was an example like this. And yeah, and then actually governments like are waking up to it and being like, right, you can't just come in, bypass all our state structures, exploit a whole lot of money out of us. We want our fair share. And so last year Zimbabwe actually like very kind of out of the blue for the market kind of announced that it could be canceling all credits, and not allowing kind of transfer from the country anymore. And that obviously scared the hell out of the market, and it got a lot of probably legal threats in the background, and a lot of pressure to for the government to change their mind about that. But it was started a dialogue about what does a fair share for the country actually look like, and actually making even the formation of these deals and of these structures a much more two-way conversation, as opposed to this kind of one-way dictatorship that it had often kind of been, and again building on that very exploitative model. So yeah, I just wanted to chime in there with that example, because yeah, it's starting to change, but it's starting to change very slowly. And again, it's not that these projects ultimately at the end of the day are actually often doing a lot of good. But yeah, there's conversations being had for sure.
Like, I think what's really striking to me with the sort of imperialism angle and around climate finance and adaptation and these kind of things is the debt crisis, where like they're just for some numbers to sort of give a sort of feeling for how it is. It's quite extreme, but 3.3 billion people live in states that spend more on interest payments than on education or health. 19 developing nations allocate more money to interest payments than education, and 45 allocate more to interest payments than health expenditures. In 2020, countries of the Global South spent a total of $372 billion servicing debt, and some African states spent more than their half of their national budget just to service debt. And this is also related to like specifically to climate funding, because when it comes to like natural disasters, when natural disasters strike, as which are of course fueled by climate change, flooding, huge storms, whatever, droughts, whatever it is, most of the money that's been mobilized for climate finance, and two-thirds, has been in the form of loans, not grants, which worsens the unsustainable debt loads of these developing countries. So when countries are, already poor countries, already countries with a lot of debt, are then, they're climate vulnerable, then they're struck by these natural disasters, and then they're forced to take even more debt with incredible interest rates to respond to this. And I think this is sort of, I guess, tangentially related, but it's also interesting when um, climate change, the effects of climate change, like forest fires, actually like burn down a forest that was previously like granted carbon credits based off of because they said we're not going to log it, or we're not going to cut down these trees, and then the effects of climate change, like a forest fire or something else, comes in and destroy these forests, and sort of gets rid of all the climate, like the carbon offsets that were justified for not cutting down the forest. I think there's a lot of paradox and a kind of irony that's caught up in the idea of relying too much on carbon offsets to finance these things. And I think it like really inspired, and it's really like really keen. Uh, I guess a really good way of looking at this, a really convincing, I think, for me, argument related to debt comes from the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, who has been a great outspoken advocate for the environment and for the global South. But she's repeatedly called for canceling debt for climate-stricken nations, just because of these reasons, just to keep these countries alive, but also to give them the resources to do their own adaptation measures, their own mitigation measures, even if they're not emitting nearly as much carbon as other countries. It's just they're not able to when they're saddled with so much debt, and this just makes the problem even worse. And I don't see I see carbon credits having a very, very limited, so far at least, so far, very limited effect of actually reversing this. That's not to say that, yeah, they couldn't, but it does have a lot of, yeah, sort of privatization, imperialist overtones, I think.
Yeah, 100%. And what's so interesting is that this is not a new problem. Like in the 80s, we had the same, debt crisis, and they, had Live Aid concert and everything to kind of draw attention and be like, right, this is, there needs to be this debt cancellation. And then the response from the international system was structural adjustment and all this conditionality and putting far more burdens and really imposing very strict, budgetary constraints and about spending priorities and and further threaten the development in these countries and so I think it's 100% right to call for cancellation, but to also very carefully look at the conditionality of any kind of debt for nature swaps or debt for climate swaps and these kind of things because especially as the global financial system gets even more complicated and complex, I think there's become even more creative ways of kind of accounting for things and again to I don't know,
Or
keep pulling.
accounting for non-things
Well,
sometimes.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And also but then also still tying, someone and often a country that is most affected, down into a really unfair situation. And so, yeah, I think it's really right to call attention to that. And I think Mia's been an amazing champion, and very clearly communicating and articulating this need, right to the top. And that it isn't, any one nation, but it's all the kind of multilateral and plurilateral organizations as well that really need to come to the table here. And I know we saw a little bit of this change, or we are seeing a little bit of this change start to happen at the World Bank and IMF in terms of them ensuring that there's some green conditionality or these other aspects to consider as part of financing and perhaps a lower interest rate if there's to finance like climate projects and things like that. But it's still tinkering around
And
the
that's
edges.
what you mean by green conditionality, right? Like more favorable terms for like environmental related projects kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
But yeah, it's still, I guess, very much tinkering around the edges, and it's hard to see that having the fully transformational effect. And at the same time as well, it's and this again comes back to the imperialist part of it. It's really also there's real questions about how much one should ever be able to kind of dictate what a sovereign nation spends its money on and how it chooses to do that. But in the era of the Paris Agreement and as you brought up, especially in the era of Article 6 and this kind of emissions trading, all of these decisions about how to run an economy and then how to align your economy to net zero or to your climate goals, it really does make it highlights how interconnected all these decisions are and how interconnected all the nations are as well in this system, but that still there's some really big inequities and inequalities to address within that system, which is hampering it and ultimately still ending up channeling far more funds to the global north. And a great example of that is investor state dispute resolution when and I think this was mentioned in the special rapporteur's letter as well, that there's still much greater risk of financial transfers from the global south to the global north because that's where all the fossil fuel entities are based, and that if countries start to shut them down, they're actually due a hell of a lot of compensation from these private tribunals that are set up with very little transparency, very little scientific expertise on it. Three commercial lawyers essentially are deciding these decisions and rendering judgments for billions of dollars, and that
And it's
can.
not only like money going from the global south to the global north, but that's also like a kind of like public funds and then becoming like going to private companies like the oil companies compensation for um, their loss of profits and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And often, so this is coming back to some very technical legal stuff, but, you know, and some of the awards that have been granted have gone way beyond, because usually you're supposed to only compensate maybe what an investor can prove they've lost. For example, if they'd commissioned some seismic testing to see about oil, maybe they could get the funding back for all that exploratory research. Whereas, like, one of the biggest cases recently, not only funded or decided that compensation was granted for that, but actually any future profits. And that gets really problematic because essentially it's propping up what is already a stranded asset and giving them guarantees that no other investment type gets, let alone,
I was
one
gonna
that.
make 100% of my like earnings next, like I was gonna double my profit next year. I can prove it. Trust me.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, it's the nature of the boom and bust cycle. And the thing is, why they're getting so much money is because they know they're taking on all this risk. And so do the investors that are investing in these companies. So yeah, it's completely absurd because actually it's like these companies have the best kind of political risk insurance kind of nearly any industry, and they're exactly the ones that we need to not be. But there is again change on the horizon. So a lot of countries are signaling they're exiting the Energy Charter Treaty. I think the UK was one of the last, the most recent to do it in like last month. And because that can help limit the legal power that these entities have to claim, expropriation, it's called, or essentially that their assets have been stolen because of these climate decisions. Yeah.
And that's probably how they phrase it too. My assets were stolen because of these climate decisions. Where it's like the sort of, yeah, justification for the assets, and being able to burn them or sell them as they wish is yeah, should have been questionable in the first place, or at least once a lot of the more information about climate change started coming out many decades ago. Yeah, it's quite striking, just the sort of justifications in the language and the framing, and yeah, sort of the way the mechanisms work. It's still very much, yeah, I would say, in the favor. So I think it seems to me like any aspect of as far as we get with these sort of agreements, with these multilateral decisions, whatever, like it's there's always a bit of a, as you said, like you have to watch out for the hidden message, the hidden sort of implications in them. um that's not to say I'm not optimistic. I think, like, for example, when I was at COP28, I did witness, like, the loss and damages fund actually getting money, which was really cool. Sometimes it was countries actually repeating or reusing, double counting, so sort of promises, I guess, that they had made in the past. So yeah, like, yeah, I guess I'm very much like in between on this. I think, like, sometimes I'm optimistic. Oh, we're actually getting money. Oh, it's actually doing something. But then you kind of look at it a little bit deeper, and you're like, well, this is actually just double counting. Oh, this has a lot of strings attached. Oh, there's these other implications to it that aren't very clear on the surface. And I think, like, yeah, I think, like, central theme that I've been kind of picking up on is transparency, and how, like, these mechanisms, I think, and the fact that it's so global and these big international agreements, multilateral, whatever, it just makes it more dense and more difficult for people to really understand. And it really takes experts to pay really close attention, read really fine print, and really pay attention to these things, and be lawyers, have law backgrounds, have these policy backgrounds to unpack it, and think about the wider implications of a sentence that I might otherwise say, oh yeah, that sounds good. And just makes it so inaccessible, and then also makes it, like, even inaccessible to countries that don't have this expertise, that don't have the resources to be able to go through these agreements or these sort of decisions, and with a fine tooth comb, and sort of pick out. And of course, it's a lot of times, um, yeah, just otherwise made to be as, like, opaque and hard to understand as possible, it seems like.
And then also, I'd just call out that a lot of times, these countries, or a lot of countries, aren't even acting in the best interest of the people that are in them. So, like, thinking of a country that's willing to sign on to these things, like, a lot of indigenous communities have really risen up against a lot of the stuff that's happening, because even the compromises that people are making for these changes to occur are still very detrimental to people living on the ground in these areas.
I think absolutely. But yeah, it's quite interesting, like with the coming back to the transparency element, I think that's why it's so um easy and almost intuitive to grasp onto specific examples like Taylor Swift, right? Because it's much easier to look at one specific person who we, know and are aware of rather than the maybe, collective of 500 people who have the far bigger impact on climate emissions, whether they're sitting in positions of political power or corporate power, and,
Whether they're the, president of COP.
yeah, exactly. Who holds a number of hats to be able to do a lot, or the next COP as well, right? So,
Yeah.
I think that's where real change, I think, can be possible. And I don't know if you guys have read the book Ministry for the Future.
I actually read it last year, in my book club, my environmental book club. Yeah.
Because what, like, one really excellent piece of that was actually, and it brought up private jets, right? It was like about the situation that there was this decision that no, we're going to take matters into our own hands and start kind of directly, I guess, targeting the people that are the biggest problem. Obviously, I'm not advocating for that now on the podcast to get for everyone to go shoot down. But, it's an interesting, I think it's only natural for us, like, when we really see the scale of the problem, to not kind of look at a very small group of and say that, really you guys are the problem and that you need to change, like that we need the systemic kind of change. And so yeah, I think while we're in this kind of reformist phase now, it's there's, the signs it's shifting, but yeah, the real question is that is it fast enough? And that's why in the net zero aligned offsetting space, that's why we kind of stress the importance of investing in removals, and just in general kind of boosting carbon stocks, rather than kind of depleting them, or and but also in our latest like revised oxide offsetting principles, we emphasize that like nature should be protected for its own right and not for its ability to kind of be commodified. And I think that's what's also where it also gets very scary and very dire, is that it's not just carbon markets now. There's biodiversity markets, nature markets, water markets, even like soil erosion protection markets is kind of, and these entities are trying to like, do one project, sell a bunch of credits, and really, and the thing is as well, because there's so much economic transaction fees for even like doing the monitoring, reporting, verification to say, oh yes, this credit helped attain water, or prevent erosion in the space, and it also led to biodiversity increase, and it also led to carbon sequestration. By the end of the day, like, you're probably financing a project that could have been like 1/100th of the size of it if you'd actually just given the money, rather than trying to commodify and squeeze out every little piece of economic, defined value from it. And it's just, yeah, that's where it gets crazy. And that's where I think we need to pull that complete pardon of the
Yeah.
Bolivia's approach to be like, no.
The Bolivia approach, yes. The smoking gun. I think the sort of I think what's really at the heart of this issue too for me, and like makes carbon offsets kind of like a very, like, just such a, I would say, almost, well, the amount of abstract labor I think that goes into like conceptualizing it, because it's the ecosystem services and trying to quantify the complexity of ecosystem services into some sort of economic value. Um, like I might have about it talked about it before on this podcast. I don't remember, but like in Iceland, Iceland is still a whaling country for commercial purposes. Um, and one of the justifications that there was some anti-whaling activists were using to sort of push against whaling was to quantify the um, economic value of whales based on their carbon sequestration, but not just their, like, direct carbon sequestration, but based on their whole lifetime, based of all the services they provide to the ocean ecosystem. So they're the bodies, as the bodies decompose, like, it feeds a bunch of smaller microbes and other species in the ocean. I'm not a biologist, I don't know all the details, but basically it's about taking all of these very, very complex biological phenomenon that, we have a like and the actually like, our understanding of this is very obscure at best. Like the marine biologist in my organization is very loath to like make any strong claims about the true carbon sequestration potential of whales. Um, and from this, though, the it was actually an economist who used to work at the IMF, Ralph Chomney, who said, "Yeah, whales are worth like $3 million in terms of carbon offsets." But then you also have to question, oh, but where are they getting the carbon credit pricing from? Like, what services that, like, because there's a lot of different prices depending on the source, where you get it from, all of these things, and just yeah, trying to put a quantification on this sort of thing. I think, and this really relates to, I think, what Clayton was bringing up with like the indigenous communities not wanting these things in the first place, or pushing against this, because it's introducing this entirely like distinct logic of the way we view nature, and is very related to the sort of, yeah, the right for nature to be protected in of itself that you're talking about. Because like I don't think we should justify not hunting whales because of the carbon sequestration things of whales, but because they're endangered species and all of these other things, like, they're whales. Just maybe don't hunt them for no reason. Um, because I think if you get too far in that, it kind of, you're justifying like very ridiculous things for very ridiculous reasons, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's the same type of logic that people, would be like, you're worth a lot as a human. If you sell your organs, you've got X, Y, Z, and it's like completely missing the point. Is that like not everything is value in life, both,
Your
natural.
kidneys are actually worth quite a bit. I've kind of
Yeah,
only
it's
one
like
of
one of
them,
those
I'm like, haven't.
motivational statements being like, you're never worthless. You're at least worth, this on the
Yeah.
black market. Yeah.
Exactly. I tell myself that every morning. You're not worth this. You're worth, I don't know, $250,000 because of your, yeah, whatever.
And I mean, I guess I'd also add thinking of the ways in which, this logic shapes relationships to nature and understanding of environments and ecologies. Like, it is really important to think about this in different ways outside of just commodification and that sort of thing, because when like this disables land and environments, and like once these places in which people live are so drastically altered, like the ripple effects are huge. And it's like, one, we should be valuing these environments for, I don't want to say no reason, but just, because there are environments, they're the world around us, and there is inherent value. But also, like, you start doing these things, and then all the people in these regions start, you know, being disabled in different ways, or developing cancers, or starvation and famine start happening, and natural disasters and everything else. Like, this isn't just um, numbers on a page, and it doesn't just drastically alter a landscape, it drastically alters everything that is connected to that, and all the people within that area, and the life ways in which people are able to move. And then, in our system of globalization, everything almost affects everything at this point. So um, I think too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it links back to Cody's point earlier about kind of saying, there are real situations where, I don't know, land has been protected or trees have been planted only for them to burn down. And that's why, again, it gets really complicated when you take it back to the international rule system, because they're trying to define the major kind of voluntary carbon market frameworks, trying to define what is an avoidable reversal and an unavoidable reversal. And then it's like, where does climate change come into that? And where does the fact that you're in essence trying to compensate something that is a near permanent emission with something that is always going to be temporary. And yeah, it just gets very problematic.
And then thinking, like, we've been talking about individuals and corporations and such too, but the whole military industrial complex is a huge component to this as well, and just geopolitics around the globe. I mean, looking at what's been happening in Palestine and the horrible violences that are occurring there, I saw that just in the first 2 months of the current conflict that's happening, so from like October to November, December-ish, over 281,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide were generated by Israel. And then, of course, all the aid that US was sending and everything else. Like, that's a huge amount. And that, like, compared to Taylor Swift in 2022, who emitted like 8,000, I mean, this comparison, it's barely a comparison, but like, Taylor Swift's carbon emissions are a huge topic when, she comes up because of the Eras tour and all this other stuff. But kind of like you were mentioning earlier, like it's a very insidious way to kind of shift blame and shift focus to individual people instead of the actual structures and forces that are causing the most damage.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, it's so relevant, and the interesting thing from like in my experience is it's been actually can be very controversial or kind of difficult. Like in my environmental organization, like Iceland is very like pro-Palestine. There's like tons of rallies. Like there's definitely, people that support Israel, but even here it's kind of very touchy to talk about the environmental causes, like impact of um like the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and to sort of put that forward, because then there's kind of question. I think like for me it's pretty easy question of just solidarity. It's like these causes are interlinked, interrelated, it's all systemic, it's all these things. But for many people it's like, well, then if you talk about, if you have an environmental protest and you talk about the environmental impact of this conflict, then then you risk having one take priority over the other, and sort of it's this kind of it's framed as almost a competition, or becomes this kind of touchy thing. Oh, you'll turn people off because they don't agree with you know the politics of the conflict or anything like that. Whereas it's just I think it's definitely not a black and white issue. Of course, it's very complicated, but there's, I think, too much complication around it to talk about the environmental impacts of it and to say like, just this is a problem.
Yeah, when I
And the
think it's
fact that like, and the fact that like countries like the US are actively, funding it.
See, they are, but then what was so interesting is that like the US Army set a net zero target, and it's also for several years, I think, identified climate change as like the biggest threat that humanity faces. And it's like, but there's that disconnect, right, between like these statements and these
Is
commitments and
that is
the
that like, scope one emissions, or does that also account scope two, scope three? Does funding Israel count into the
exactly.
scope two
Yeah,
emissions kind of thing?
exactly, exactly. But the fact is that although the quality of their mitigation target aside, that they're recognizing this as the biggest like security threat for us globally. And so yeah, it's like it's really interesting because you could have this lens through which actually saying that if armies actually cared about keeping people safe, then there'd be like climate core essentially right now, and out there planting trees and doing the adaptation measures. Um, and they're not. And so, I think that's when it comes back to these power structures and really asking critical questions about, what people's purpose are in this situation.
Yeah, I love that there's like the group, I think they're called Make Food Not Bombs or something like this. And I think you could also relate this to the US Army. Plant trees, not conflict, or something like that, not missiles. I think it would be really funny to see like some admiral or general or something just out there like, doing his green thumb thing, planting trees and whatnot.
Yeah, it'd be like seek nature rather than oil or other things. Yeah.
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 Right now we have in carbon offsetting, basically the ones profiteering from it, essentially, writing the rule book that they can profit by it as well. And so even in these reform attempts, because people look at the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market and the Voluntary Carbon Integrity Initiative, and point to the initiatives as good things that they're going to reform the market, but fundamentally because they still possess the same actors in it, the documents that they're producing right now are only kind of reaffirming the status quo rather than shifting it. And so I think now is a critical time, and carbon markets are at this critical juncture where either we will see this divorce between the kind of economic profiteering that's been happening and sometimes, and often actually just basic fraud that is occurring. And again, some governments and jurisdictions are waking up to this and putting laws in place. But really, yeah, it's either the complete dissolution of the system or the shift to truly looking at how to get more money flowing into the ground and into projects, but also the local communities. And I think that is where all of our efforts need to be focused. And so, yeah, as much as it is the case of instances of maybe stupid decisions and private jets and all these other things are reported kind of fuel for our fire, but that the major fire we have to put out is kind of much more widespread and pervasive and deeply rooted in our systems. And so I think it's great that you guys are having these kinds of conversations which pull us out of these specific issues and do engage with the broader systems that they're embedded in, and also